Hello boys and girls, and thank you for tuning in for another episode of Ushanka Show, stories about life in the Soviet Union. And speaking of boys and girls, still male audience is at 94.1% and female audience of Ushanka Show just 5.6%. Recently I made a video about my experience with Soviet Greyhound intercity bus service, and today I would like to tell you about bus ticket prices as well as my experience of riding a car. There were a couple times I was lucky enough to ride a car from my village back to Kiev, so we're going to talk about that today. And just a friendly reminder, all my videos about Soviet public transportation are located in a separate playlist, and link will be below in the comment section. So here's the example of the Soviet era intercity bus ticket, but before we talk about prices, I need to remind you about different types of intercity buses. There were two categories of intercity buses, мягкий и жесткий, and I translated a while back incorrectly. It's not soft bus and hard bus, it's plush bus, just like mattresses, and firm bus. So here's the interior of жесткий автобус, firm bus made by LAZ, and I believe LAZ buses were the most common buses in the Soviet Union, and especially in the firm category. And of course, bus tickets were cheaper for the firm buses. And Hungarian made Ikarus 250 was the most comfortable plush bus. As you see, interior is way more comfortable. It was wider, taller, and quieter. And of course, chairs were way more comfortable and they could recline. LAZ, which is a bus factory located in western Ukraine in Lviv, also manufactured plush style buses like you could see these pictures taken by Uncle Bill in Baikal area. So they were also more comfortable, but not as good as Ikarus. Okay, now since we're armed with the knowledge about plush and firm buses in the Soviet Union, let's take a look again at our bus ticket. Okay, so it says полный билет, full ticket, or детский, children's ticket. So if you take a child with you, child is 50% off. You still have to buy him a ticket, but it'll be 50% off. Full price, it's полный билет. And it's a full ticket as well, полный билет. Then it says from the station to the station. So that's where the person that sells you a ticket will write the names of towns. In my case, will be Kiev to Chernigiv, or later Kiev to Shors. And then it says жесткий автобус. So that's your firm bus. Место номер. So it's the number of your chair, of your seat. And then отправление, what time your bus is departing. Hour time, and then day and the year. And the left side of the ticket was a bunch of numbers. It's we'll look at it a little bit differently, but it's zones, distances, and the cost. Okay, so that's the same ticket but vertically. So you got first numbers are zones, поясы from 1st to 21st. Second is расстояние, distance. So it starts from 1 to 5 kilometers and goes all the way to between 100 to 110. Once again, it's the so-called firm bus. Then you have price, children's ticket, rubles and kopecks, R and K, and then full price, once again, ruble kopecks. So for adult, to drive, take a bus and ride it for 100 kilometers will cost 1 ruble and 58 kopecks. And 1 ruble 58 kopecks is pretty much 1% of your monthly salary in the Soviet Union, because people were making around 150 rubles in 1980s. And now we're looking at plush style bus ticket. And I apologize, this scan is not as good. I couldn't find any better quality. So once again, full ticket, children's ticket. The only difference, it says мягкий автобус. Date looks like was 1984. And on the left we have again zones and prices. And zones goes as far as 25th zone, which is between 140 to 150 kilometers. So based on these numbers, the cost of taking a plush bus Ikarus from Kiev to Chernigiv, which is 140 kilometers, was 2 rubles 90 kopecks per adult, plus Comrade Sergei, who was a little kid at that time, another 1 ruble 45 kopecks. That's just to Chernigiv. And using the same price grid, taking a Ikarus bus from Kiev all the way to Shors, which is now called Snovsk, it's about 210 kilometers. We're talking about 4 rubles 10 kopecks per adult ticket. So I ran some numbers, and it looks like for my family, so 2 adults, 1 kid, to travel from Kiev all the way to the village, and it's using plush bus, then a last leg of 30 kilometers of firm bus, would set our family back 12 rubles one way, 24 rubles round trip, and that's about 16% of my mother's or my father's monthly salary. So for example, if you're making $4,000 take home a month, it's like $640 round trip for 3 people on the bus. So based on the Soviet plush bus price grid, 160 kilometers, which is 100 miles, will set you back exactly 3 rubles. Which means if you take a Soviet plush bus Ikarus, hypothetically from Chicago to New York City, which is 800 miles, it will set you back 24 rubles. And I just checked current prices at Greyhound website. Same trip, Chicago, New York City, in a plush style Greyhound bus will set you back about $100. The cheapest ticket's about 80, the highest 160, so we'll just call it $100. And this is what I found out comparing apples to apples, Chicago to New York trip based on distance and prices, that paying 24 rubles for this trip when your salary is 150 rubles a month would be the same if you make $625 a month and you pay $100 to travel from Chicago to New York City, which means or Soviet salaries were extremely low or our bus ticket prices were extremely high. If you read my book American Diaries 1995, you may remember that I took that bus. I traveled from Benton Harbor, Michigan, all the way back to Chicago and then all the way back to New York City in the fall of 1995. I did exactly the same trip again back in 1996. So I'm familiar with that bus ride and I'm planning to share my experiences. I'm gonna read you that part of the book in my next video. Okay, now let's go back to the Soviet Ukraine circa 1984. That's when I traveled by car for the very first time from the village back to Kiev. I think it happened 1984, maybe 1983. So by then, my grandpa Sergei passed away. So my grandparents traveled to Kiev to spend the winter with us, and my grandpa got sick on the way to Kiev. I mentioned that story a long time ago. So he died, and then next summer, grandma and I traveled back to village, and that's where I spent all summer with her again in the village without grandpa. And in the August of that year, something horrible had happened. It actually was my fault. So my buddies and I were exploring our barn and we found old kerosene lamp which still had liquid. So being kids, we were curious if that old kerosene still can catch fire. So we dumped the contents on the grass and one of my friends lit the match and that kerosene, started burning brightly. It was like late at night, late in the evening, so there was bright flames, and my grandma saw flames out of the window. She was inside the house, so she ran, screamed at us, and I think that stress caused her a stroke. So technically it was my fault, and later my mom told me that you should understand that you killed your grandmom, and I felt really bad about it. So my grandma after the stroke was feeling worse and worse, so I had to get in touch with my parents in Kiev and tell them, hey, grandma is like not doing well. So my mom came, and then when she confirmed that the situation was getting worse, it was my grandma, she telegrammed my dad, and he found a friend with the car to go and pick us up because grandma just was not in shape to travel back to Kiev by bus. And of course back then there was no cell phone, no internet. I mean, no one had telephone in that village except like the postal office and the collective farm office. So we didn't know what my dad could come up with, and suddenly early in the morning one day, like 8 o'clock, there's a car stopping by our house, and it was my dad's friend in his Niva car. And I'm planning to make a separate video about these cars. So it was made at Vaz factory, same factory was making Zhiguli, but this was a 2-door, like a small SUV type car. It was extremely expensive, all-wheel drive, and I discovered later that it wasn't selling really well because it was small, really thirsty on gas, non-practical, just 2 doors, and the price was I think like 11,000 rubles, so close to the Volga price points. So those cars weren't selling well, and that actually the government had to reduce prices to get them moving. And as I mentioned earlier, we had no idea when someone will come to pick us up. So that was this crazy rush because a guy showed up. He's like, okay, we gotta go, pack your stuff, and we're driving back to Kiev. So we literally had to, grab whatever we could, put in the car, lock the house, and we drove back. So that was first time ever in my life that I traveled from the village all the way back to Kiev by car. And that was interesting. And I actually remember that ride a little bit. I was on the front seat, my mom and grandma were in the back seat. And I remember a guy talking about the car. I think my mom was slightly envious because, my dad's friends owned cars, and we even didn't dream about buying a car. I mean, we had no money whatsoever. And he's just telling well, my wife really wanted Volga, but there was a waiting list and Nivas were available right away. So I talked to her into buy a Niva, and she doesn't really like it, except at one time we had to drive, off-road, and she saw how I just plowed through the fields, and she's like, Volga would probably get stuck, right? And yeah. So I kind of remember that conversation, but otherwise wasn't really comfortable riding because, it's like a little SUV and really noisy and super cramped. But we were back in Kiev maybe 4 or 5 hours, and I remember that was actually a huge disappointment for me because, village was my paradise. Summer, forever summer, no school, no homework. And usually my trip back to Kiev was torturous 12-hour trip. So you're paying the price to return in from paradise to normal life in the city. And here was literally in the morning, I was having breakfast in the village. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm already in Kiev. And I felt almost violated. It was just happened way too quick. So mentally I was still in the village and suddenly I'm in Kiev. So that car ride was actually a huge disappointment. Although it was cool to be in the car, it happened so fast, the trip, that I just didn't feel right. Then a couple of years later, maybe in 1986 or 87, even when Chernobyl exploded, we went to the village in July and August. My cousin went with the Zimetra. He borrowed the Zimetra from somebody, and our village got lucky. The Chernobyl cloud missed our village, so that was pretty clean. So we went again for the summer. And my cousin Sasha Alexander, by that time he bought a Moskvich, and he drove to the village with my dad. He brought my dad with him, and they did some repairs in the car. And then when it was time to go back, I rode with them back to Kiev. And this photo was actually taken in the morning where we're heading back. This is my friend Igor, who used to live in Chernigiv, the town that we used to drive through on the way to the village. And as I said, summer was about over, so he needed to go back home to start school. I needed to go home. And we took him along and dropped him off in Chernigiv right next to his apartment building. And I remember, it was the first time I appreciated having a car. It's wow, how convenient it is to have a car, because usually if you travel by bus, you get to the central bus station, right? And then you need to spend another, 40 minutes to an hour using public transportation getting back home. In this case, we dropped off Igor right next door to his apartment building. And that's, I think, first time ever this is really cool to have your own car. And of course, my ultimate trip in Ukraine by car was back in August of 2019 when I went all the way and I rented a car in Boryspil airport. And the only issue was to find a car with automatic transmission. I'm ashamed to admit that I don't drive manual. I learned how to drive in America when I was 27. It was automatic transmissions, so that was a big challenge to find a car with automatic transmissions in Ukraine. And I didn't want anything fancy like SUV, whatever, so we rented a small Hyundai. As I said, it had automatic transmission and power windows, power locks only on the front doors. So front passenger and driver doors had power windows, power locks. Back doors had manual crank. That was hilarious. So I drove this car from Boryspil near Kiev all the way to my village, and it took us 4 hours, and that was amazing. It was amazingly stressful as well because Ukrainian drivers are pretty wild. I had to watch like a hawk. It was stressful on that part, but we had air conditioning, so I cranked the air, so my kid was sleeping in the back seat. No issues. We just drove, arrived to village so fast, and of course it was bizarre for me because this road was always familiar, but I was always in the bus, never in charge, never being a driver. So there was totally different experience to actually drive this road that I knew since my childhood. Another hilarious part, so just as we left airport, and it's 2019, and I remember I just living in the airport, and the first thing you see living in the Boryspil International Airport near Kiev, there was this huge sign advertising the strip club in Kiev. And I was like, who in the world would let people do that? You know, it was like the first impression of foreigners arriving to Ukraine. Hey, there's a strip club. The men can have a lot of fun. And then you drive past this dealership that sells Porsches and Bentleys. So, you know, it's just bad. It gives a really wrong message about the country. And when I was looking at the Google Maps trying to find the best route to get from the airport, you know, back to my highway going to Chernihiv, it gave me this back road that will catch up the bypass around Brovary. And that bypass, there was a spot where it was a giant pothole on my way, and I couldn't swerve into the incoming lane because it was a semi-truck coming. So I ended up hitting that pothole so hard that the stereo fell out, and I thought I messed up the tire. So I look at my son like, okay, kid, we already arrived. It was literally like less than 5 minutes on the road, and I almost wrecked the car because of that pothole. So then, of course, I had to be super careful and slow down. And yeah, that was an interesting start. And another great, unusual experience was having a car while we were in the village. So now we had so much flexibility and mobility. You know, if we wanted to go grocery shopping into town 30 kilometers away, no problems, hop in the car. And I remember one time, you know, I said to my mom, like, hey, you want to come with us? So I asked my kid, like, hey, do you mind to sit in the back seat? Because I want mom to be in the front. And she looked so proud, you know, like sit in the front seat next to her son, like, you know, we're doing fine. So yeah, we would drive to Snovsk to do shopping, and my kid liked to catch Pokemons. And of course, in Ukraine, there was unique Pokemon. So he would spend a couple of hours running around catching those silly things. And we go to different town. And then when my brother was ready to come and stay with us for a weekend, you know, he was still in Kiev working. I drove to Chernihiv, which is 100 kilometers away, picked him up there. We went to McDonald's because my kid wanted a little break from Ukrainian cuisine. So we stopped at McDonald's. Then my brother showed up. He took a bus from Kiev. Then we drove back. Then on the Monday morning, then I drove him back to Chernihiv again. So yeah, having a car was amazing. And I just wanted to say a couple of words about this picture. I believe I mentioned it before. So it was kind of cool to see in Snovsk this old 1980s Ford Econoline, right? And what I discovered about this van, that's actually people used it to smuggle fuel from Russia. So that's before the full-blown war. So you know, those Econolines, they have 2 tanks, and it's a diesel, right? So these guys swapped the engine. They removed the original Ford diesel and install Mercedes Sprinter engine, so way more economical. And then they will have just a little bit of fuel to get to Russia across the border. And in Russia, diesel fuel was way cheaper. So they will refuel their van completely, both tanks, drive back to Snovsk and sell diesel to the local gas station. And they will do like 2 trips a day, you know, so that will be, I don't know, maybe about 40 miles one way, and they will make enough money that they don't have to work. All they do is just 2 trips a day, and by the law, by the rules, if you drive the vehicle that has original OEM tanks, not extra tanks installed, you're allowed to drive through without paying any tax. So they were just shuttling every day from Ukraine to Russia and back, and making money bringing diesel in this giant Ford Econoline fuel tank. But of course, we're talking about 2019. Everything changed in 2022. Okay, my friends, so it's all I have for you today. And in my next story, I will share my experience about Greyhound bus traveling from Michigan to New York City. I'm just going to read you parts of my book. So I think it'll be kind of interesting and to discuss that too. Otherwise, thank you for watching Ushanka Show. Please don't forget to give me a like if you like the story. Your super thanks always appreciated, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye. We're right now at the small town of Snovsk. That's kind of like original town when my mother village is located. And it's funny, my kid was hunting Pokemons around here, and this place was called the Lost Lenin of Ukraine. So that was one of the lost Lenin monuments still existed, but apparently people came from Kiev or maybe Western Ukraine and they knocked it down. So this is the place where the lost Lenin of Ukraine was still located.